And we know that having diversity of thought is what actually creates true business results. Best place for us to start just from a mindset perspective. The DEIB work was sort of misunderstood from day one. We did a study 2 years ago and found that 74% of underrepresented job seekers see diversity as a disadvantage. There are certain cultures that have been literally taught, do not negotiate, do not push back. But I'm actually really encouraged by some of these companies that literally say, this is the exact salary and that's it. We have to sort of break the mold a little bit and maybe rethink who's responsible and maybe rethink the strategies we implement to achieve this goal. Next generation of CEOs that I meet that are just inherently seeing diversity as essential for their work.
Hello, Arthur.
Hey, Chris.
How's it going? Thanks for coming on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So you're a prominent diversity expert. So I wanted to jump in hot on a kind of high-level question, really, around diversity. I know there's lots of different takes of diversity, people thinking about different methods and ways of creating diverse workforces. But if we could start from a place, what do you think the ultimate goal of diverse hiring is, and what are the benefits to organizations building diverse workforces?
Well, Chris, you're absolutely right. I mean, this has been an evolving conversation, one that I think, sadly, in many cases, has become somewhat charged. It has risen to the top of the conversation for most leadership teams. I believe what we're ultimately trying to achieve with our diversity recruiting efforts is to build a workforce and a team that represents the society and the community of the people that we serve, right? If we think about, really the long-term implications of that, we do want a team that is reflective of, the audiences we're trying to reach with our products, with our services. And we know that having diversity of thought is what actually creates true business results from a perspective of creativity, innovation, retention, culture. But at the end of the day, we want to have, the widest reach to the best talent. I believe that if we cast a wider net, we're able to have the best possible talent through our pipeline. So diversity recruiting is all about making that happen from a sourcing standpoint, making it happen from an impartial process standpoint. So the decisions that we make hopefully are not rooted in bias. They're objective and fair. And hopefully it means getting to the best possible talent out there.
Lots has changed across the last couple of years. We were just talking about the SVB situation, COVID happening, and this kind of boom and bust cycle that's happened. And that's led the way for a lot of change in how people work and live, and the balance between work and life, of remote working, flexible working. Do you see that as being a benefit to companies hiring diverse candidates? And do you think it's been a benefit to the diverse candidates themselves in this new way of working? Are you seeing it as a positive?
Well, you're absolutely right. Look, if we take the trends of the last 2 or 3 years between the murder of George Floyd, the heightened attention around racial equity that was long overdue, COVID, the pandemic, a shift to remote and hybrid work, and then honestly, fairly radical transparency around the DEI efforts that were happening in a lot of these companies, and sometimes the lack of progress that they've made after making fairly prominent commitments, right? All of this kind of comes together. And I would say, honestly, there have been real gains and there have been real setbacks in terms of all of these shifts. I wouldn't say there's a monolithic, like, this is best, this is net positive for the space. And I'll give you an example. We have seen the shift to remote work actually having some amazing accessibility implications for working parents and for people with disabilities, where there were true systemic barriers to showing up to an office. There were true systemic barriers to showing up to an interview. All of a sudden, many heads of talent acquisition, heads of HR woke up and realized, wait, we can have people interview remotely and we can have them work remotely. This is all possible. But it's also introduced a lot of bias, right? Now interviewing people and paying, militant attention to what's on the screen has presented all kinds of interesting anchor bias and affirmation bias and confirmation bias and a number of things that didn't really happen when our initial phone screen was on truly a phone, right? So I think with each of these shifts, there has been it's been a double-edged sword. And I think for us to be able to embrace the things that are positive and to be really mindful of some of the pitfalls so that our process can honestly be adjusted to account for them. That's really what's necessary right now.
It's really interesting. With the increased activity of Zoom call interviews and remote interviewing, what are some of the things that companies can do to be mindful of diversity during that process? Because I absolutely, agree with you that some of the benefits that companies have now and candidates have in terms of flexibility and remote and flexible working styles probably has been replaced by some negatives and some drawbacks too. So how do you think companies can counter that and make sure that they're paying attention to diversity with different interviewing styles?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Chris. So I would start by saying, if we take a step back as individuals making hiring decisions, the best place for us to start, just from a mindset perspective, is to really try and put ourselves in the shoes of different job seekers. And if we think about diversity very holistically, not just based on what we concede, but if we think about the neurodivergent job seeker, right, who we may never know until they actually start the job that they are neurodiverse, right? If we think about the individual from a marginalized community that has covered the fact that they're in that community because they've been afraid that it would hinder their opportunities. We did a study 2 years ago and found that 74% of underrepresented job seekers see diversity as a disadvantage. We start to put ourselves really in the shoes and in that mindset of the underrepresented job seeker. And first and foremost, we would just say lead with empathy. Part of the remote, way that we're hiring right now means that we can actually move quite quickly. We can make snap decisions with very limited data. We know that all the research shows we're typically making our initial judgment on a candidate in 7 seconds, and we're making a hiring decision and an interview within the first 15 minutes of the conversation, right? All of this is just really sort of, limiting, oftentimes mindful and I would say thoughtful, decisions that we're making. So putting ourselves in that mindset, step one. I would say the second piece is making the whole job process extremely transparent to the job seeker up front. There are no surprises. You're able to say, this is what you can expect in the process. This is how many conversations. This, by the way, is an upcoming work assignment. We're anticipating being in the late stage of the process, so you have ample time to do it. And just keeping that line of communication open with the job seeker. So there are just no surprises. Part of the inequity is when people are unaware of what's going to happen, and they're caught off guard and they realize, I don't have the capacity, or I wasn't sort of set up, with the context that I needed for this part in the process. We really believe, and Chris, I know you and I have spoken about this, that the majority of bias shows up in the interview process, largely not because of the recruiter. The recruiters are usually not the ones that we have to worry about. It's usually the hiring managers and folks that are outside of the TA function. So really getting folks to commit to a structured interview process that has predefined questions and a quantifiable criteria for those questions. And finally, we would just say that, when it comes to the offer stage, there's so much that happens that perpetuates pay inequity. And so one of the things that we've been, we've been really mindful of is trying to follow, some of the recent trends with states of making pay ranges transparent. We know that, we're required to do so in many states now, but also trying to have a consistent approach to negotiations, because we know that that cisgender white men are way more likely to negotiate and achieve higher pay because of negotiating than marginalized communities.
There's a few really interesting things I want to dig a bit deeper on there. The first one is the hiring manager piece, and I you've been in situations, I'm sure a lot of people that are listening have, where you have a hiring manager that doesn't buy into the processes or the formula that you need to build to bring in diverse candidates, or the value of it. They might say that they want a diverse team, but when there's a lot of urgency and pressure to fill vacancies, they want the fastest result. They're not willing to wait. They don't want to follow a proper process. They just want people in as quickly as possible, which makes them maybe cut corners a little bit in terms of diversity hiring and the processes needed. How, if I'm kind of a TA manager in-house, working with a hiring manager that's maybe resistant to doing these kinds of things and building our processes to hire diverse candidates, how can I get buy-in? Like, what are some of the ways that I can encourage, the team? Obviously, they should see, hopefully, the obvious reasons, but maybe that's not the case. So how could I help that person, educate that person, or get them bought in? Is there a way?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. This is the I would say the classic TA dilemma, and you've seen this. I know that Talentful's really amazing at helping talent teams basically build and scale really great TA processes. And we know the challenge that TA leaders and TA managers go through with hiring managers. It's certainly no news, right? What I recommend to TA managers is that they shift the mindset of their role from being a TA leader to being basically a hiring coach. And as a hiring coach, I actually don't think it's always the winning formula to go to that hiring manager and beat the drum on diversity. Diversity matters. We should be doing something. We committed to this as an organization. That'll work for some. I think it's actually better to shift gears to talk about the strategic benefit of actually using a structured process, casting a wider net. And I'll give you an example. We know that it's still a super competitive labor market, right? If we were to have a candidate that has many other offers and they enter an interview process that's super unstructured, where they've had 4 simultaneous interviews or four concurrent interviews, and they're essentially getting asked the exact same question, right? It's going to look like this organization is not at all coordinated, isn't using their time wisely, and honestly, the hiring manager could be spending time spinning wheels, basically covering a lot of bases that have already been covered, when they could be spending that time, having had a coordinated process, actually selling the candidate on why they should join. And so that's a great example and a case study for a hiring manager to hear as to why a structured process is strategic for them. It's the best use of their time. It's what's going to close the best candidate. And we need to give hiring managers more stories like that. We're not trying to make you do more work. We're not trying to just, focus on diversity because it's good for the world. We're trying to make sure you close on the most exceptional candidate. It happens to be, by the way, the equitable route, right? But it's so that you get the best people on your team. And I think the more that we turn the corner to that kind of conversation, I think hiring managers start to flip the switch on, oh, okay, this is actually strategically the best move for me.
Yeah, it's really about the best way to hire includes processes that prioritize diversity hiring.
That's right. And in a perfect world, I think where the space goes is that all the DEI work is absolutely like embedded and hidden in our processes. We're not overtly referencing it. It should just be baked into the mindset and into the process. And if we have to really bolt it on so overtly, I think we're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah, it's really about how do we hire the best people and how do we create the best hiring processes, get the best results for an organization, and that naturally includes diverse candidates, right?
That's right.
And
that's right.
Yeah, that's a really great way of looking at it. And another point you mentioned, which I hear a lot, is, and I'm really intrigued to just get your thoughts on this, is you were saying cis white males typically negotiate higher salaries, and is there a kind of a reason for that, a quantifiable reason? Is it more education around negotiating for those kinds of people? Is it just like overwhelmingly confident people in that space? I know I've seen some data around men that look at job descriptions are more likely to apply for a job if it matches 50%
Right.
of their skill set, whereas women maybe have to be like 90%.
Yep.
Those aren't real numbers, but you get the point. So why do you think there is a gap in this kind of negotiation ability?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's multifaceted. So there's one piece, which is, we go back to the 74% statistic, that there's already a lack of confidence among marginalized communities when they enter the hiring process. We know that. Diversity is a disadvantage. There are actually, in many cases, cultural implications around negotiating. So there are certain cultures that have been literally taught, do not negotiate, do not push back. My life partner, his parents were refugees, and when they first came to the States from Vietnam and China, they very much told their kids, don't be the nail that sticks out of the board, right? Toe the line, don't make waves. We don't want to upset anyone. So I have spoken to many DEI executives, in fact, that are now in DEI leadership roles, who were taught as kids, do not negotiate, do not push back, right? So that's a cultural piece. There also is the component of I think there being this built-in confidence that we have seen that does make, for a cisgender white man who does not feel marginalized and underrepresented in a process, more likely to sort of culturally and interpersonally be willing to ask for more. And it is where, we're also used to, basically trying to, field requests. And if someone doesn't make requests, we don't respond to it. The other piece is that we've seen that historical pay inequities are pulled through and perpetuated in a process. So we know, of course, it's illegal to ask someone their pay history, right? But inherently it comes up and even informally. So, candidates will be asked, what's your intended range for the role? They might be anchoring to being below market when they give us that range. So if we're responding to that, if we haven't set upfront parameters for what the range will be, we might anchor to what already was historically a low range, below what they should be paid. And so we see kind of the combination of all of these things kind of perpetuating all of this. And then companies have the need beyond the offer to make sure that they're monitoring pay inequities to follow. So Salesforce did a whole pay equity kind of reboot and did a $3 million pay adjustment. And a year later, it popped right back as the same inequities. They realized they needed an ongoing process to basically maintain their pay through promotions and through internal mobility. So it even goes beyond the hiring process.
And if we take the hiring process as kind of one point in time, what can companies do to eliminate this, difference in negotiation ability or the cultural, issues that you mentioned? Are there things that companies can do to just make sure that you have a fair process where maybe if someone hasn't got the personality or the willingness to negotiate, that they're still getting what they deserve?
So there have been different approaches. I mean, one is certainly that the company internally agrees to pay bands, sets a very specific pay range upfront, communicates that, actually puts it in the job description. I encourage companies to put it in the JD even before the state requires it. If you're hiring remotely and, at a certain point, that will be the new standard in the States. And I think I'm curious if you're seeing that in EMEA as well. But it's certainly where policy is going. Having a really clear and consistent policy around negotiation. There are some that basically say, this is the range or this is the specific salary. We just don't negotiate. We've put our flag in the ground that is our first and final and best offer. And there is just, as a policy, we don't negotiate. And that has basically eliminated a lot of, the inherent bias that comes later because it's just super transparent to the candidate up front. There's no ambiguity there. If they do negotiate, I see companies setting really specific parameters that we have the ability to go 10%, outside of that range or 10% from offer, but we can't go any further. And if we do, we have to get executive sign off. So there's a built-in mechanism for accountability. But I'm actually really encouraged by some of these companies that literally say, this is the exact salary and that's it. There will be no changes from here. It's actually saving a lot of recruiters on the back and forth of that process later on.
Talentful provides flexible recruiting solutions to the world's most ambitious companies. Are you thinking about ways to add flexibility to your talent function? With recent market volatility and hiring set to return to growth mode in the near future, there's never been a better time to choose the right partner to help you scale. Talentful's embedded sourcing, recruiting, coordination, and talent advisory services have been trusted by the world's leading brands. Companies such as Atlassian, Microsoft, Expedia, Pinterest, Waymo, and more. Whether you're hiring across engineering, go-to-market, or G&A, Talentful has got you covered. To find out how Talentful can help you, visit talentful.com.
I definitely like the idea in principle. I mean, you've probably seen the Netflix job description and a bunch of other people that are gaming it with the laws saying with the range.
Right, these crazy ranges.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I still think there needs to probably be some tweaking on how we really get to the end goal there. But I totally agree that bandings definitely, and having the same bandings across your organization for the same level roles is a really good place to start. And we talked about earlier, Joe, the changes that have happened in the landscape and how that's impacted diversity hiring in a positive or a detrimental way. But I think that one of the things that's very clearly happened, I've seen a lot in the press and in the media about, is how diversity efforts have really lost traction during this kind of post-pandemic layoffs. We saw a massive spike in companies spending a lot on bringing specific diversity hires, head of DE&I, etc., into businesses, building specific diversity hiring teams, and it seems like those teams now have been disproportionately impacted. So I guess, what's your take on what's happening at the moment, and how companies can maybe keep a focus on that work during tough times?
Yeah, it is absolutely true. I mean, and I know you guys also have a really good pulse on just the state of these talent teams and the challenges they've been through. I would start by saying, Chris, that my take on it is the DEIB work was sort of misunderstood from day one. It's such an emerging category, and if you were to ask the average CEO what does success look like, you would get, I think, a lot of confused answers and definitely a very wide distribution of answers. So the simple nature that folks didn't have like alignment around what success looked like, what the efforts entailed, and who was responsible for them. There was a huge misconception in many organizations that we set some diversity goals, we hire a head of DEI, and then they're going to just go figure this out for us and go, come back with the case study of what worked. And the reality is, these organizations need everyone on board, especially all the leadership team, to mobilize the work, and it won't happen overnight. And to have a head of DEI that typically isn't even on the leadership team and is oftentimes not given proper resources to do the work, and certainly to not do the work alone, it just has set the work up to be frustratingly almost impossible. So I think to that end, what certainly happened is the work also in many cases felt discretionary when push came to shove and all of a sudden the economy wasn't in a great place. And that's unfortunate because we know that it's the need is still there and it's really good for business and everything else. But that was, I think, why we saw layoffs that impact DEI teams and leaders specifically. And it has meant, to your point, that a lot of the progress that has been done, it made in the last couple of years, has been undone to some extent, and it's left a lot of folks just sort of jaded and frustrated. And I'm hoping that we don't lose the steam, and I hope it gives us the opportunity to start kind of to what we were talking about earlier, start to think about how this work is embedded in everyone's role and every part of our process, and it doesn't have to live in this kind of isolated place. If the work feels sort of like it's a bolt-on, it really is performative in many cases, and it's certainly not sustainable. So I do think that this, what's the expression? Let's not like waste a good crisis. Part of the opportunity right now, if we are cutting back on capacity, is how do we democratize ownership? How do we make this part of everyone's job? And how do we embed it into every stage of our process?
I'm really interested in your take on this. And let's imagine that you were walking into a company and you had a talent team already existing, and they didn't have necessarily a specific diversity hiring function or leader in the business. What would be your approach to doing that, to leveling up that organization from a talent perspective to have diversity embedded? I'm sure it's a really complex answer and you might not be able to summarize it in 2 minutes, but what are some of the first things that you would do, and focus on? Would you bring in someone who focused on it? Would you provide education to the team? Like what would be some of the quick wins for you?
It's a really great question. I think a lot of talent teams don't sit down and really sort of think about their theory of change around this. So it starts with the acknowledgement that there is basically a capability and a skills gap, and I think an awareness gap, and there's just general capacity that's needed to mobilize the changes to the process, and that capacity isn't invented overnight. So I'm certainly not against the idea of bringing someone in, whether it's an external partner or it's a full-time person or team. But I think it's critical that they are, like, everything that happens around that team or that individual is contextualized around this person as a catalyst and is not the sole owner. This person is here to add some capacity to make sure we are up-leveling our awareness, our skills, our capabilities as a team to collectively own this work. This person's helping project manage perhaps the changes that need to happen to our process, but they are not the sole owners, right? Otherwise, again, what we talked about earlier, that there's this impossible, task that's put on the shoulders of this person or team, and it's the rest of the organization isn't on board, right? So I'm all for bringing folks in as long as it's contextualized, and then really getting clear on like where are we today, where do we want to be, what is the gap of how we get there. And it might honestly be that the company needs some external training partners. They might need to go do an audit of their processes and systems and figure out where they have those gaps. But the biggest thing is if the leadership team basically all signs up and says, we're all kind of quasi chief diversity officers. That's a part of our job. We have a responsibility on our teams, in our departments, to basically collectively lead this work, and it won't just fall to single people. The organizations that have made that shift, like the New York Times, right? Groups like the New York Times have enabled there to be a true collective ownership and accountability around this work. They've made tremendous progress in the work because of that.
I hate to boil this down to kind of objective metrics, but
yeah,
people like to have some kind of goal and some kind of metric associated to hiring. Hiring is quite a metric-driven part of the business, whether it's time to hire, cost per hire, quality of hire. Is there a metric around diversity hiring that you've seen to be effective or impactful when tracking the performance or the progression of diversity within a business from a hiring point of view?
Yeah, well, the piece that I find is really important to kind of think about with this is that there isn't typically one universal target that is going to be perfect and applicable for every single role. So we recommend basically a role or a function specific strategy. And the way that I would recommend an organization think about it is if they were to just distill the steps of their hiring process into 3 convenient phases: top of funnel, interview stage, final offer, right? Who essentially is hired. You can look at the diversity across each of these stages, see where the drop off is, and determine where do we want to place some kind of a yardstick and goal. And an example of this is, many organizations use a 2 in the pool, a Rooney rule, or what's called the Mansfort rule, which is a 30% of the pool is underrepresented. And that's a great, set of frameworks to place into the interview stage, where you can say, look, we can't necessarily always control top of funnel, but we can control the number of folks we have in our initial interviews or final interviews, right? And if we're committing to a target of X percentage of our pool, that particular function is underrepresented, it might take a little bit more time, but we'll reach that target, and we're going to measure ourselves if we don't, right? So I usually recommend trying to use basically look at your existing numbers, determine where the drop off or the gap is, where you need some accountability, and try to create somewhat of a function specific target. And it doesn't have to just be this arbitrary, hey, we want to make sure that 50% of our final hires are underrepresented. Maybe it's sort of focusing in more on that middle stage, which you can control a bit more to get to that final outcome.
Yeah, that's really helpful and very useful. I definitely like that approach because it's about, like you said at the beginning, making sure that your pipeline is representative of the world out there, right? And that makes total sense. So I wanted to finish off on a positive note and get your thoughts on what you're most excited about when it comes to the future of hiring, and specifically maybe diversity hiring.
There's so much to be excited about. Look, I think the last 2 years have felt deflating and challenging for many folks, and inevitably that makes a ton of sense. I mean, there's been no shortage of challenges and no shortage of headwinds. But first of all, look, we know so much more about this space than we did 10 years ago, right? We have a much more holistic understanding of what we mean by diversity. We have a much more nuanced understanding of intersectionality. We have a much greater sense of consistent ways that we can reduce bias in our process. I think we have a much greater sense of the behavior change that's needed of stakeholders, not just the talent acquisition team, right, in our process. So what I'm honestly encouraged by, Chris, is that we know so much more. The need has not gone away. The need's, I think, been even more, articulately defined. And I also think that we know that sort of the traditional way of approaching this problem has not really worked. So I like to think that the next generation of companies is kind of is inherently growing in a time when folks are saying if we repeat the same actions, we shouldn't expect to achieve different results. We have to sort of break the mold a little bit and maybe rethink who's responsible and maybe rethink the strategies we implement to achieve this goal. And I'm really encouraged, Chris, by the next generation of CEOs that I meet that are just inherently seeing diversity as essential for their work. It's not feeling like it's a bolt on. It's like, no, of course we're going to do this. So all of that makes me super excited about what's happening. We don't have our shortage of challenges with the work, but I think it's all moving in a forward direction.
Awesome. Well, Arthur, the work that you do is incredibly important and valuable for companies. So I'll put some links to where people can find you, but where can they find you? How can they reach you?
Yes. So you can learn more about my book, Hiring for Diversity, at hiringfordiversity.com. Plenty Search is a boutique startup executive search firm that I work at. As a partner, we help early stage companies build their leadership teams. We're proud to be Talentful partners. And so you can check us out at plentysearch.com. We're excited to, intersect with folks in this movement. It's definitely one of those, we're all in it together moments.
Awesome. Well, time flew by, and I'm hoping to have you on another podcast very soon, but thanks a lot.